Hello guys and welcome to Barking Mad Tabletop. My name's Nick and I'm starting a new campaign. So let's talk about that. So yeah, I am starting a new campaign. It's sort of a mid-season replacement, if you will. We decided to put our ongoing Pathfinder game on hiatus, and there was nothing wrong with the system. We all like it very, very much, but it was a game that we transferred over from D&D 5e because I just couldn't take that game anymore, and we started at 7th level, which was a mistake in hindsight. It resulted in some weirdness because of unfamiliarity with the system, starting characters at such high power levels. It just became a bit weird, and we still want to continue that game. We want to revisit those characters, and we absolutely will, but we decided that in order to make a game that sort of does justice to the system of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we were going to start a level 1 game from scratch. That's not this game. We want that game to be Kingmaker, the big ol' fuck off 1 to 20 module that started as a Pathfinder 1st Edition game and also became a very successful video game, which I loved very, very much. We're going to be playing that from level 1. I don't know if we're going to go all the way to 20 in one go. We're probably going to increment it a bit, because I think that's just the sort of thing I want to do. But we are very much looking forward to that. Unfortunately, it is not out yet for Foundry, and we are going to be using Foundry to play it, so I'm waiting for the official Foundry module to drop for that. In the meantime, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to play a sort of mid-season replacement campaign. It's going to be taking place in Dragonbane, which is a system by Free League. I think I talked about it in my very first video after I became a RPG channel. Pretty rules-light fantasy system. It is actually a new edition of the Swedish, cultural analog to Dungeons and Dragons. It's our classic fantasy RPG. This is a new edition. It's very streamlined, very easy, lightweight, so I think it will function as a bit of a palate cleanser. So I decided, given that we're going to be doing that I would sort of talk about it in a campaign diary format. I would go over my prep work, I would go over my expectations for any given session, and then also give a report about what happened during that session and how it went. And I'm doing that because I like that sort of content. It's very much cribbed from Matt Colville, because he used to do those, but I really, really liked those videos, and I think that they would be fun to make. I'm not promising I'm going to do them every time, because there might not be something particularly exciting happening during a session, I don't know. I'll make them when I feel like it, because the only one placing any obligations on me is myself. So yes, that's pretty much why I'm doing this, and I think it might be interesting in case there's any potential game masters watching, giving us someone who's not a big YouTuber in any stretch, or sort of what the process they go through and what they do might be interesting, and also for my players it might be interesting to have a peek behind the curtain a little bit, sort of demystify the process for them, because I think some of them have an inordinate view of what it takes to be a GM. Because it really doesn't take that much more than being a player, it just requires putting in a little bit of work. But nonetheless, that is what I'm going to be doing. So the campaign is going to be taking place in my own personal setting called Wakemare. It's a relatively traditional fantasy world. It has everything you would expect from, fantasy RPGs. That's sort of deliberate on my part. I want to easily be able to take stuff and put it in there, and just shift it around a little bit and easily use it. So that's why it's like that. It just has my own bits and twists of lore and background stuff, and everything I improv on the fly becomes canon, which I know doesn't really matter, but matters to me. Specifically, it's going to be taking place about 400 years into the past of Wakemare, as compared to when the Pathfinder game we're playing took place, and it's going to be taking place after a supernatural disaster called the Cataclysm, in which the veil between the various planes of existence in the multiverse was sundered, and hordes of horrible creatures from all planes, demons, devils, elementals, what have you, streamed out and wreaked havoc on the world until stopped by an organization known as the Cataclysmic Council, which sort of united all the kingdoms, all the religious orders, all the other organizations in the world, and sort of unite them towards this common goal of stopping the cataclysm. So that is sort of the backdrop of the game that we're going to be playing. I don't have a plot in mind specifically. I don't have any detailed ideas. I think that would be a mistake for this particular one. I have some vague notions of maybe how things might develop, but I'm leaving those indefinite for now. I don't want to spend work or time sort of developing and nailing down something and then forcing anything in that direction. That is contrary to what I think a GM should be, especially in a system like this. I have adventures that I'm planning on running, planning on adapting. That is very much the sort of GM I am. I like to take pre-written adventures and shift and recontextualize and change and make them my own and put them into my world. That's also a very Matt Colville thing to do. He does that a lot as well. Not that I took that idea from him, I don't think, because I think I started doing that before I even watched a single Matt Colville video, so I think we just sort of landed on similar paths. But regardless, that is sort of my idea. I have a few vague ideas of where it might develop, but I'm going to see how the actual game develops before I make any grand plot or anything like that. It might not even be that there is a grand plot to this one. It might just be a series of interconnected sort of adventures with the only real connective tissue being the party itself, and that's fine too. That's a very old school style of play, really. And you know, that will be fine. That will be fun, even. So that might be how it is. But I'm very excited to give this a try. I have a few adventures on the way that I'm going to be talking about, especially the one I prepared for the very first session. But we'll get to that. We've already had a very productive session 0 where we established some baseline relationships between the PCs and established that they know each other for about 1 week. That is a sort of a favorite of mine because it's long enough to where you can have a sort of a basic opinion about one another, but still there's still stuff left to discover because it's still very new. And that's actually, the relationships thing is a thing I cribbed from another Freely game, Forbidden Lands, which has these relationships sort of expressed as a one-sentence thing. What do you think about this character, basically? And I said that's a good mechanic to steal because it sort of establishes a baseline from which to roleplay, which is always good. We are going to be starting in a region called the Grand Duchy of Urseldar, which has featured in some games I've run before, so that's going to be fun. Seeing it sort of in the past. And the characters we got out of it are as follows. We've got Archibald Montgomery Brightstone de Beauchamp, who is a knight from Mearn, and Mearn in my world is a sort of very classic fairy tale knightly medieval kingdom. It's sort of, if you're familiar with The Witcher, it's very much like Toussaint, except not quite as explicitly satirical in nature. But Archibald is a knight of Mearn with a shameful secret. We've got Bumble Lunafoot, a halfling thief who fancies herself something of a Robin Hood type, take from the rich, give to the poor, and she stole something she really shouldn't have. Then we've got Vassalor Oceanheel, who is a hot-headed elven mariner who served the Cataclysmic Council out on the sea, fighting all sorts of weird sea creatures, and who was sort of left to wander in search of purpose after the Cataclysm was declared over. Then we have Mikhail Starshine, who is a scholar from the Royal University of Urseldar, who has some unorthodox ideas about the origins of the Cataclysm and has sort of set off on an adventure to find evidence to support them. And then finally we have Stumple Root Stumbler, who is a halfling druid who left his druidic circle to explore the wider world and returned to it only to find it destroyed by cataclysmic forces and sort of set off in search of answers. I'm a really big fan of all these characters because they all have something in their backgrounds that I as a GM can take and use as a cudgel and beat them over the head with, because that's always fun. For me as a GM, but I'm very much excited to start playing with these characters. So with that background sort of established, I spent some time figuring out exactly how I wanted to start the campaign off. I considered a few adventures. I found one that I really liked and I will incorporate into the campaign, but I couldn't think of a way to use that as the starting point. I couldn't think of a hook that made that suitable as a starting adventure. It's sort of something that I felt you had to run into, so I'm definitely going to still be incorporating this into the game. It's just going to be at a later point. I considered also Matt Colville's Delian Tomb, and while I think it's very competently executed as a starting adventure, I did not find it inspiring as a starting point for this particular campaign. Eventually I found an adventure called Horror at Havel's Cross, by Winghorn Press. It's on the DM's Guild, and I found that very intriguing, very inspiring, and I found easy ways to sort of transform that into something in my setting that I could tie into the story of my world and also the story of the characters. So in Horror at Havel's Cross, the characters sort of contacted by this scholar who needs an escort because they've gotten word from their fellow archaeologists up in some hills. That they found something important, and she's too high adventurous to sort of escort that artifact back to civilization. And that already, there was a easy hook for me to tie into, because we have Mikael in the party, who is a scholar. So I decided this scholar, this person, this halfling scholar who contacts the party and wants to hire them, is someone he knows from university, because I figure that's a good way to give them an easy tie and an easy hook into the very first adventure to get things going. And then subsequently they're supposed to go to Havel's Cross, which is this sort of roadside inn, fortified. They're supposed to find a massacre there. There's some goblins there who you fight, but who are not the ones who caused the massacre there. And there's clues to that effect sort of as they go, and then eventually they go into to find this old ancient temple and ghouls, lots of ghouls that they fight, and then finally a ghoulish magical artifact. Now, in the adventure as written, this artifact is the bone of the first ever ghoul, whatever, and the temple they find that the bone is this artifact is found at is like an ancient elven temple from a cult, an ancient elven death cult, something like that. I decided to change that up quite substantially. So for this one I decided to make it so, yes, the half-elven scholar, and not only the scholar who contacts them, but the rest of the archaeological excavation team are all familiar to Mikael Starshine, and I don't think I settled on having her contact him specifically, but it's just gonna be like a nice coincidence. Oh, you know these people, things sometimes transpire, but I might change that at the last second. I might have them be contacted specifically because she knows him, but I'm unsure if that's how I want to go quite yet. That might be a last minute decision that I adjust, but that's where I'm at the moment. So I had a little bit of work to do. Primarily, I had to create ghouls, because there are no ghouls by default in Dragonbane. There's actually only there's 3 forms of undead, 2 of which were not appropriate for this specific purpose. And skeletons, which would have worked, but I wanted ghouls. I like ghouls, so I had to create some ghouls, and it wasn't difficult. It wasn't a difficult process. You just sort of, because it's not a very complicated system, so there's not a lot of rules you need to keep in mind. You just sort of need to eyeball it, and I hope I did a good job eyeballing it. I hope I didn't over or under tune them. I hope they make for a satisfying challenge. I gave them a poison on their claw attack. And the reason I'm not going to go into too much detail mechanically on the system just yet, because I'm going to save that for when I do the quest board, which should be soon. Once I have 1 or 2 sessions under my belt, I will do a quest board where I will go into the mechanics in a more detailed manner. But I gave them a poison thing on the claw attack, and I gave their claw attack 2d6 damage, which is a fair amount. It's pretty good, but it's very in line, I think, for the damage in the game. And some poison, and because in Pathfinder elves are immune to the ghoul poison, I made elves immune to the ghoul poison. So I hope they become a satisfying challenge. Goblins there are in the system, so they're all ready-made goblins, so I just put some goblins when they were going to fight goblins at that inn before they get to the ghoul place. So I put some goblins in there. They're led by a hobgoblin which I had to design, but it wasn't too difficult. I just kind of used the template for an orc warrior. I changed the HP, I think, and the gear, and then that was sort of it. And then I had a hobgoblin. So that's going to be good. And then the final boss is the final sort of boss of the adventure is one of the archaeologists corrupted by this ghoulish artifact into sort of a semi-ghoul, and I decided to make him a monster with a capital M. And the game sort of distinguishes between NPC enemies, which is stuff like a goblin, a bandit. Those are NPCs. They function like NPCs in combat. And then you have monsters, capital M, which have a table of attacks, and they don't need to roll to hit, they just do damage, and the PCs have to avoid them. And so they're far more dangerous, far more potent. So I decided to make that final boss a monster, and normally monsters in Dragonbane have a d6 attack table. I had some issues coming up with for this particular one. I've done monsters before in Dragonbane that I could very easily come with this, but for this one specifically I had a hard time coming up with those 2 last attacks, so I made it a d4 table instead. And I wanted to make it a monster because I also wanted to introduce him to the concept, and I figured, honestly, given the description of him and how he was going to function in the combat, I thought a monster was more appropriate than just making it an NPC. So that's what I ended up doing. As for sort of the narrative around it, I adjusted the temple, because the temple in the original adventure, as I mentioned, is dedicated to this elven death cult originally, and then eventually they found some artifacts related to the first ghoul, and and this and that. But I decided that I was going to make it related to the Cataclysm. Again, to give Mikhail an extra hook in there, and also just explain sort of more the archaeologists and what they were doing. And so I decided that this used to be an ancient temple dedicated to the Bone Matron, who in my world is a sort of nurturing, good-ish god of death and the dead, essentially, which was then taken over, presumably by some who were related in some way to the start of the Cataclysm, and went in there and defaced the icons of the Bone Matron, who hates undead, and turned it into a place for racing the undead, for racing the ghouls. And the bone in the adventure, the artifact I've been talking about, I think I've been saying bone off and on, but the artifact in the adventure is a bone. It's called the Bone of Dorasane, I think. And it's supposed to be the bone of the first ever ghoul, and that's a cool idea. That's a cool idea. I'm not knocking that, but I decided to go with something more tied into my setting, so I made it something called the Bone of Thanatolis. And the Thanatolis, the players don't know this, but Thanatolis is a very important figure in the history of my world, but he's a very secret figure. No one essentially knows about it at this point. There's a very good reason for that, but I don't think that's going to be like the major focus of the campaign or anything. But I wanted to tie it in and make it tied into something that made sense to me. So I made it the Bone of Thanatolis, which is an artifact related to this person Thanatolis, and that's turning people into ghouls. Very much a necromantic figure, Thanatolis, as you can probably tell from the name. But I decided that this temple was related in some way to the beginning of the Cataclysm, and it was sort of turned into, it was desecrated and turned into a place of evil, where originally was a place of good. I have some ideas for some random events to get them there. Per the adventure, there is a 3-day distance between where they meet and where the temple is, where the dig site is. And I think I'm going to keep that in, because I quite like the idea of traveling and having, conversations around the campfire overnight, and also some random events that I have prepared. So I'm going to do that. In the Dragonbane rules, there is this system for when you go off the beaten path, you sort of appoint a pathfinder, funnily enough, who rolls a bushcraft, just like survival roll, and sort of if they fail, they're leading the way basically, and if they fail, there's a travel mishap that happens, and I like that. I do. It's cool. I want to keep that in, but I don't have the physical rule book for this game yet, and I'm not going to be using my laptop or anything at the table this time around. First time ever I'm doing that, so I'm not going to have those rules in front of me. I know they are on the GM screen, which I'm waiting for, as well as the physical rules, so hopefully once I have that I will be able to incorporate those. But for now, I'm just going to say that the Halfling Scholar, whose name is Winsome Landy, she knows where it is, so she's leading them, so there's no roll or anything like that required, so there's no chance of a mishap. That is sort of where I'm at in terms of my prep. I am pretty much finished now. Basically what I had to do is, I didn't have to do this, but basically what I did was, I took the PDF for Horror Havel's Cross, and I rewrote it in bullet point format, with my changes, my adjustments, and also mechanical adjustments for Dragonbane. So, changing out perception for awareness, and DCs, because there's no DCs in Dragonbane, because it's a roll under system. Normally I wouldn't have to do that, but because I don't, I only have the adventure on PDF, if I was going to just print that out and convert on the fly, which I'm reasonably comfortable doing, I was still going to have, a page of notes with the changes. So I was going to have to print things twice over. That's just seemed unnecessary to me, so I just rewrote it in bullet point format in a usable way. That I'm going to be doing it that way instead. So hopefully for the other adventures I have planned, I won't need to do that, because I actually will have them physically. So I can do a page of notes, of changes, and then I can convert the rest on the fly if need be. Then at the end of the adventure, they're going to come back to the inn where they met. I don't know if I went over that. Yeah, they're going to start in the inn, because it's a classic and I like it. They're going to come back to the inn, they're going to get their reward, and then I'm going to present them two sort of branching paths that lead to different adventures. And obviously it's an open game. They are free to disregard this. Chances are, though, they're going to pick one of the two paths, and one of the two paths is an invitation to a grand tournament in a neighbouring kingdom, and another one is a merchant's guild looking for an escort somewhere, and those are both going to lead into two different adventures. I think maybe passing through the same vector, I will sort of have to I will have to play it by ear on that one, but they're going to eventually lead to two different branching paths into two different adventures, and then I'm going to sort of open it up and see where I land. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover for the prep phase. So today is Sunday, the 25th of June 2023. I'm going to be running the very first session on Thursday the 29th, so in 4 days, and I will report back once I've done so, and I will sort of go over how it went, how it differed from what I expected, and everything like that. So I'll see you then. I'm excited. I'll see you then. So it is now a few days later. I have actually gone ahead and run the first session, or rather the first 2 sessions. It ended up running a bit too long, which was one of the mistakes that I made. But overall, I think it went very, very well. So I'm going to be going into a description of what happened, and sort of my thought process regarding what happened, and how it intersected with my preparation, and so on and so forth. I did make some mistakes. There were a few missteps from me, but overall I think it was a very successful start to the campaign. So let's get going. So we started off with some introductory narration from me about the state of the world and the shaky political situation of the continent Erdis that they're on in the aftermath of the cataclysm, and then we went into the first like sort of narrative start. They started in a tavern because that is classic and that is fun. Some people think it's tired. I think it's a classic for a reason. It's a very nice start. It gives an immediate sort of ambiance to the start of the session. I always recommend starting in taverns. This tavern is called the Cheering Horse. It's in a trading post called Goldwyn, which is, it's not a village, it's just a trading post that has like a blacksmithy, a general shop that has some common items, and this inn basically, and a notice board, and the notice board is important for later. But that's where we started. We started with some nice roleplay. I had them interact a bit with each other, feel each other out roleplay wise, and then I had the barmaid, the waitress, come up and take their orders. And here's actually a good lesson for GMs, is like always try and have, if not prepared, then at least try and improv, like a little bit of detail around the food and drink that an inn or a tavern is serving, because that's always, it just adds to immersion. It helps. It adds something to the session. I think that if you just you order some food, cool, doesn't, it's kind of, that's a little boring. I think it's a relatively easy thing to go in and adjust and add to, so as to increase immersion just a little bit. In this case, I had the tavern because it was early in the morning. It was an autumn day. I described it was foggy and cold outside, and how the inn was nice and warm, but abuzz with conversation, and it smelled nicely of food and of red leaf smoke, which is sort of my version of tobacco. And I described how today's sort of food item, the breakfast item, was an oat porridge with butter and honey, and that helps immersion. We had actually some nice roleplay just based off of that, where one player described her character, Bumble, the halfling thief, speaking with a mouthful and porridge going everywhere, and that's always fun when people take your descriptions and run with them. But then I explained why the party was there. They'd seen a notice a few days ago from one Professor Winsome Landy, who was actually an old colleague of Mikhail, one of the characters, back from university. That's not something that he established, that's something I established for him and let him know. And there's sort of a lesson in that, I think. You don't have to hook every player character every time, but it's always helpful, especially at the start of a campaign, to have some personal hook for someone, to let them sort of tie into it a bit more closely. Although everyone was involved, obviously there's gold on the line, and gold is always a good motivator. And then I had a handout with, I'd written the notice in character for Landy, and I had that ready to go when we started, and that's another lesson, I guess. Handouts are fun. So we started off when they were waiting for Landy to arrive. As I said, they were interacting with each other, had a nice time. I had the barmaid come back and ask Archibald, another player character who's a knight, ostensibly at least, about I had her ask him on behalf of the inn operator if he was in service to the Grand Duke, who is the ruler of the Grand Duchy they're in, and he said no, but I did serve in the Cataclysm. And I sort of imagined that people would be grateful to knights. Knights, already have the imagination of the people as these noble protectors, and especially if they serve in the Cataclysm or are in direct service to the Grand Duke, there would be some gratitude, or at least something to that effect from the populace. So I had him knock a little bit off the price of the meal for that. Carried on like that for a bit. There was, as I said, waiting for Landy to arrive and give them the details of the mission. This is straight out from the Horror Tables Cross Adventure by Winghorn Press. But then the player playing Bumble, the halfling thief again, began sort of looking around the tavern looking for things to steal and such. And I asked for a character sheet and I rolled a little secret roll, and then said proceed, because that roll, she failed that roll, and I won't say what that will mean, but it will mean something in the future, and that ties directly into her backstory in some way. So that's always fun. And then eventually I have Landy arrive. She's coming from upstairs in the inn, down from her room, and she explains sort of the situation, the background for the adventure that we're going to start here. So Landy comes down the stairs. She recognizes Mikhail, obviously, and they have a bit of a conversation. And he tells her that they are there for the job that she had posted. So they sit down, they have a little bit of a conversation, being old colleagues, catching up a little bit, and then Landy describes the background of the adventure they're about to go on, which is that she and a group of these archaeologists, most of whom Mikhail also knew from back at the university, I figured that was a good way, again, to keep him hooked to it, were conducting an excavation of some old ruins up in the hills. Specifically, these are the Dursasail Hills, which in my world, these hills are Goblin Hills, and she had been contacted by the leader of the excavation team that they had found some important artifact that he wanted escorted back to civilization, and he needed some escorts, and that's where the adventurers come in. And they talk a bit more about the details. In the original adventure as written, this temple is related to some unspecified elven death cult, but I made it that it was originally a temple of the Bone Matron, who is this sort of nurturing god of death and the afterlife in my setting, that then the archaeologists suspected was in some way related to the start of the cataclysm, which no one really knows that much about, just that it happened and some people presumably were behind it. So there's some more chatter about the details of the adventure, and then they get some gear and then they set off on the journey, which is a 3-day journey to the dig site. And they are supposed to meet a member of the excavation team at an inn along the way. So they set off from the trading post known as Goldwyn, and they head out. And so we'll get into the sort of travel section. So they set off for the first day's journey, they make some more conversation on the road, and then night comes and they make camp, and Vassalor, who is the sort of hot-headed elf sailor, he takes the first watch. I ask him what he's doing. He says he starts sharpening his scimitar and stuff like that, doing a little bit of solo roleplay in that sense. And I have him roll on a random events table I prepared, and he rolled, and the event that came up was these seeds. That the wind, I described the wind bringing him this collection of seeds, sort of hitting him as he's sitting there. I described the seeds as looking like sunflower seeds in the outer shell, but with these weird blue veins running through them. And I have some plans, and I know what these seeds do, generally, but not quite in the way that it turned out. And players always surprise you, and that's part of the fun of being a GM, is when players take something you prepared and you present it to them, and they take it and they fuck with it, and you have to sort of improvise a little bit on the spot. So he starts experimenting with these seeds. He throws them in the fire, and I described this wasn't something I'd thought of. This is something I described in the moment. He threw it in the fire, and I described there as being a brief flash of blue light as it burned up. Then he crushes one, and I described that there's this weird blue, like slight amount of viscous blue liquid that comes out. Again, that's not something I'd thought of. I just reasoned if I had these veins running through them, presumably they're from something. And then he ate the seeds. And I did not quite know how to adjudicate that at the moment. I had to improvise, and so I decided that I was going to take his character sheet, and I rolled against his constitution, which is how you resist poison in this game. It wasn't poison, it was just I figured there could be some ill effect if you failed that roll, and if so, I would have improvised it in the moment. But he succeeded on that roll, and then I knew roughly what these seeds did in a general sense, but I didn't quite know what they were going to do mechanically if this happened, and this is something I didn't prepare, but I sort of improvised, and I think I came up with a good solution, which is that if you eat these seeds, they set your intelligence to 12. Now, if you're already at 12 or above, it doesn't do anything for you, but if you're lower than that, you become smarter, you become a bit more aware, and that's what I described happening, so that was fun. And there's going to be more on those seeds later, probably, depending on which other random events get rolled up. I like random events to make travel a bit interesting. I like travel in general, but since I wasn't using the sort of Pathfinder and pathfinding mishaps rule that come in the game, that come in Dragonbane, this particular time, because I didn't have them in front of me, I probably should have just sped through the remaining days of travel. I did mostly, but sort of in an annoying way where I still had them roll for making camp and stuff like that, which is, again, it's in the rules. That's not me making something up. But because this was the first time, and because they just want to get to the adventure, start getting stuff done, I probably should have just fast-forwarded through the remaining 2 days of travel instead of having them roll to make camps and stuff like that, because I wasn't using the full rule set anyway, and so it was sort of, it was unnecessary, I think, and it slowed down the session a little bit, and that's contributed to it running over time a little bit. But nonetheless, we continued on, and then eventually they arrived at the inn, Havel's Cross. So the party arrives at the inn, and they see this disturbing aftermath of some horrible thing before them. They see smoke rising from some sort of external building behind the inn. They smell smoke and burnt flesh coming from there, as well as ashes. And in front of them, before the few meters in front of the palisade and the gate that leads into the inn, they see a dead horse that's been torn to pieces, clawed up, partially eaten. And Mikhail goes up and he investigates the horse. I have him roll healing, which is analogous roughly to medicine in Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons, and he succeeds on that roll, and he concludes that what killed this horse was something roughly human-sized, with razor-sharp teeth and sharp claws. And so the party approach the inn, and they do so quite cautiously. At first, at least, Bumble and Archibald sort of take up positions next to the door, and Bumble eavesdrops. She's trying to listen to see if they hear something inside the inn. I have a roll awareness. She succeeds, and I describe her hearing sounds inside, and it wasn't immediately apparent to her what I was trying to describe, which was people speaking a language that she did not understand and using sounds that she could not replicate. And it was not immediately apparent to her that that's what I was trying to convey. She interpreted it first as just noise a monster would make, like growls and that sort of thing. And then I sort of elucidated, and that's a lesson in there for you, is don't be afraid to volunteer information, especially when it is clear to you, because I think it will be, that players do not, sometimes when they haven't fully comprehended what it is you're trying to convey. And that's understandable, it happens, people can't read your mind, so don't be afraid when it's clear that the players have misunderstood to volunteer information that clarifies the situation. Do not be afraid to do that, because it is going to be necessary at some point, so don't hold back information unnecessarily. But I elucidated and I clarified what it was she was hearing, and then at that point Vassalor, again the elf who is a hothead, decides to knock boom, boom, boom on the door, and I described them hearing sort of activity freezing. We took a quick break there, and then we opened back up, and at that point Vassalor slammed the door open, and we launched right into a combat encounter. And it was 4 goblins and a hobgoblin. Hobgoblins don't actually have stats in Dragonbane yet, so I had to make those up, but that was relatively trivial. I will put a link to those stats in the description below. And here's actually where I fucked up, because I was so excited about getting into combat. I like combat. I forgot to describe that there had been a massacre inside the inn. Yeah, it's a pretty big thing to forget to describe, and as a result of me forgetting to describe it in time, it did not have the same weight, did not have the same impression as it ought to have. But the inn was supposed to be, and in fact I did describe it like that later, just littered with corpses and blood, and smelling horribly of death, and I forgot to do that. I fucked up, and it sort of robbed it a little bit of the weight. We recovered a little bit later, but you're gonna fuck up sometimes as a GM. Sometimes it results in the tone not being quite what you wanted, and yeah, sometimes you just forget things. So that's a shame, but we recovered. We launched into the combat, and this combat is straight from the adventure. Except I think there's 6 goblins in the adventure as written. I put 4 goblin archers or scouts I think, strict speaking, is the stat block for those guys. Those are officially in the game. And then 1 Hobgoblin. I had to make up those stats as well. I gave him an ability, because normally when you make NPCs in Dragonbane, and I'll go into that more when I do the quest board video, normally you just sort of treat them like player characters. You give them heroic abilities from the list of player character stuff, and you try and puzzle it together that way. But you only list the skills that are relevant, so on and so forth. I'll go into more detail about that later. But I created a heroic ability for this guy that is not available to players, that I don't intend to make available to players. I call it Second Wind, after the 5e fighter feature, which is just, I gave him 3 willpower points, which is the resource you spend on heroic abilities, and I have, so he could do 1 use of Second Wind, which is to restore, I think, a D10 HP. I'll put those stats in the description below again. And I did that because I knew that, according to the adventure, he's supposed to surrender, and it's very easy, if they get some lucky rolls in there, to just completely kill him off in one go. So I wanted that to not happen, so he had a chance to surrender and give them the information they wanted. And so he fought. He actually did some fair amount of damage. Dragonbane can get pretty deadly, you guys. 1 damage roll can down a player character if they don't have large amounts of armor, and really the only person who's heavily armored in the party is Sir Archibald. The others have, I think, just leather, which is armor rating 1, meaning they reduce the damage they take by 1. And then we have Stumple, the druid, who did not, unfortunately, have any armor on him. But they managed to knock the Hobgoblin, his name is Craxel, but I don't think that ever came up for them, down to half HP. He surrendered, and they exchanged some information. Immediately it was sort of apparent to the players that these goblins had not killed these people in the inn, or attacked the inn, just they were there looting the bodies, essentially. So they interrogated them, got some information, and then win some landy. And this sort of issue, actually, that I had playing, it's just I sort of sometimes forgot to roleplay Landy as well as I could have. I think that's something I'm going to have to keep an eye on in the future, really make sure that they felt that she was there, because sometimes I just got caught up in describing the environments they were in, the adventurers as such, and I forgot about Landy a little bit. But Landy wanted to press on and get to the dig site because she's worried that something might have happened to her fellow colleagues, fellow archaeologists. The players take a stretch rest, which is sort of analogous to a short rest in 5e, and some, except for Bumble and Stumple, who spend some time going through the inn and getting some loot. So they find some money. Normally in Dragonbane I would use treasure cards, but I do not have the treasure cards yet because I have not received my physical copy yet. Hopefully that will be arriving very soon. So I just prepared some die rolls. I randomly generated a little bit of money and some rations and stuff like that. And then they set off towards the dig site. So they arrive at the dig site, and I described there as being 10 of these trenches. And they didn't really investigate the trenches too much, but if they had, they would have found some naughty surprises in there, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And then I described there as also as being a large, squat building of grey stone that had been smoothed by wind and just time. So the trenches, obviously were supposed to represent the archaeologists digging around there, and that's from the adventure as written, and as well as the temple also is from the adventure as written. But there's a symbol above the archway entrance, the sort of arched entrance to the temple, and originally in the adventure that is an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, but I made it Rognar the Raven, which is a symbol of the Bone Matron. Again, I made this a temple of the Bone Matron. I also described it as having been defaced, like someone had taken a tool and defaced it, as part of presumably desecrating this place to make it a place of undeath rather than a peaceful transition to death, a place dedicated to rebirth or something like that. And they head inside the temple, and they see 2 sort of sideways side doors, one heading left and one heading right. And from the one on the left, they hear some wet noises. Oh, and I forgot as well that they found these drag marks that indicated someone had been pulled up the staircase into the temple. And so they hear these wet noises coming from the left chamber, and they decide to try and sneak up on whatever's in there, because they can sort of hear, they presume that something's in there, and they start heading in that direction. And in Dragonbane, when there is a group check, the person with the worst chance of success rolls that roll. You know, the idea being that you're only as good at something as the person in your group who is worst at that. And so that became Archibald, Sir Archibald, because his stealth is really low, his sneaking skill rather, pardon me, is really low, and he's wearing plate armor, so he has a bane, meaning he rolls twice and takes the worst result. And yet, somehow, as he makes that fucking roll, he succeeds. Meaning they got a surprise attack on the ghouls that were in that room, and there were two of those ghouls tearing apart a corpse and eating it. Something that is worth noting as well is that these ghouls were actually transformed members of the archaeological expedition, and Mikhail recognized them. That is not something I forgot while actually running the session, just something I forgot while recording. But we had some nice emotional roleplay off of that from Mikhail and his player, and it was very satisfying. But yes, I did not forget that when actually running the session, I just forgot it while recording, and that's why I'm interjecting with that right now. A corpse presumably taken from the inn, and yeah, surprise in Dragonbane is really killer, because if everyone gets in on the surprise, which they did, because the because the ghouls failed their awareness rolls to notice them approach. Yeah, God, I still can't get over it. Actually, it was so horribly unlikely for Archibald to succeed on that sneaking roll, and yet he did, and it really worked out well for them, really, because a surprise in Dragonbane means that you get to pick, everyone who's in on the surprise attack gets to pick when initiative they go, right? Because the initiative's handled by these cards, they get to pick their cards. They could go, oh, we put this guy in this order, this guy in this order, this guy in this order, and then eventually the enemies who have been surprised are the ones to go, and they draw from the deck normally. Most of the time that's going to mean they go last, and initiative can be killer in this game. So Stumple the Druid, he has a spell called Banish, which is specifically to fight undead. And ghouls are undead. That's actually another note. There are no ghouls in Dragonbane either. I had to make those. That was pretty easy as well. I'll post those stats in the description below. But nonetheless, Stumple casts Banish, and he obliterates one of the ghouls. Before combat even starts, he obliterates it. It goes up in a pile of ash, and then Bumble rushes in. No, sorry, Archibald goes in, he attacks. I think he actually missed that attack against the ghoul, but then Bumble rushes in, and she has an ability called Backstab, which is it works a little bit like Sneak Attack in Pathfinder or D&D, where they can deal extra damage on an enemy if they have someone nearby. And she did that. She killed the second ghoul, and then a third ghoul. This is actually from the adventure. If there's combat in the other room, then a ghoul from the room over on the right will come and join. So I had that happen, and then Vassalor obliterates those ghouls. So yeah, surprise is really nasty, and sometimes your monsters die. That's just something you have to come to peace with as a GM. Sometimes your monsters die in ignoble ways, in ways that are a little underwhelming. But for the players, it wasn't underwhelming. For the players, it was fun. They got the drop on these monsters. They did really well, and they slaughtered them. Unfortunately, that is where we had to leave it off, because one of our players had a hard out at 10 p.m. that day. So we called it there, and we resolved to come back the next day and play. So we came back the next day, and they started to actually investigate the temple. One room, the one off to the left where they fought the ghouls, had had a bunch of like birth motifs. There was like flowers and vines and roses and like babies, like depictions of babies and young humanoid creatures overall that had been again defaced, presumably as part of desecrating this temple to prepare it to be an instrument of undeath and evil, as opposed to just stewarding the transition between life and death, which is the domain of the Bone Matron. And then the other room that they examined, the one off to the right, where the third ghoul had come from, had more death motifs, like wilted roses and stuff like that, and there was like a maze of bones on the ceiling. That description came straight out of the adventure as written. And then the main chamber had these pools of blood leading up towards to an altar, basically at the far end of the hall, and the altar had these bowls and a box on it, and basically that was a puzzle to open a secret door. I'm not going to go into the details of the puzzle because you'll have to read the adventure to get that. But there was a puzzle there, and eventually they solved it. But before that happened, they hear Landy screaming from outside, and they rush out and they see skeletons climbing out of the trenches, and that's what they would have found if they investigated them. They would have seen these skeletons, and so we have a skeleton fight that actually got pretty rough. I had more skeletons than players this time. Not many. I had 6 skeletons compared to 5 player characters, and it got pretty rough. It got pretty rough. Action economy really is super important in this game. That's why one of the most important things you can give monsters in this game is give them more turns. But nonetheless, we had a good time. They fought some skeletons. It got pretty rough. And here's where Mikhail started having really bad luck on his healing rolls, because he couldn't for the life of him succeed on the healing roll to get people who'd fallen up. But there is a really cool mechanic in Dragonbane, which is rally, which is you can either rally someone else or you can rally yourself, just a little bit harder, to keep fighting even at 0 HP, and you're still making death rolls and everything, but you keep fighting. That's actually a really cool mechanic. Again, you'll hear more about that in the quest board video about the game. But they fought the skeletons. It got pretty rough. Eventually they came out on top, however, and then they went back into the temple. They resolved the puzzle, which again I'm not going to go into detail about what the puzzle is, and it reveals this secret door opens, and a staircase descending down into the earth materializes or reveals itself, and they're hit with this horrible stench coming out, and I have them all roll constitution rolls to see if they become sickly, because that would play a role later, but they all succeeded. And so they proceeded down, and I described the staircase as being really old and rough-hewn, like carved out of cavern, rather than like deliberately built like the rest of the temple, and like strewn with spider webs and weird mosses, which Stumple, whose entire character, Stumple the Druid, his entire character is all about moss. So that resulted in some fun roleplay there as well. And then we descended further down until finally coming to the sort of final encounter area of this adventure. So they descend into this room, and they see an altar similar to the one upstairs, but larger, and on top of that there is this corpse in horrible condition, just absolutely torn apart, and there's another corpse off to the side in similar condition, and then right in front of the staircase where the place is coming down off, there is another corpse, this one of a dwarf, who seems to have died from blunt force trauma, and I described it sort of as looking like stone, because in my setting, Wakemare dwarves are partially made of stone, or at least a stone-like substance, so it doesn't quite look like just a humanoid skull been caved in. It looked a bit different, more rock-like. So that's how I described it. And so the player characters step more inside, they start investigating the room. They hear these sobbing noises, and eventually it's revealed that these are coming from Calador, who is the final member of the expedition. There's a bit of an interaction. He's clutching a bone, and this is sort of the centerpiece of the adventure. He describes his story, which is that he found the bone, and they presumed that it was important. This was in fact the artifact that he contacted Landy about needing an escort for. And he says that eventually his colleagues started acting strange and eventually turned into ghouls and attacked him, and he had to run and hide in this room, and eventually even the dwarf, who was one of their bodyguards, assaulted him, and he had to kill him. Immediately the players started seeing some holes in the story, which is intentional on the part of the adventure and my part. He couldn't explain what the fresh corpses were doing, and then Archibald, whose weakness is that he orders people around even when he really shouldn't, and he says to Calador, "Give me the bone," and Calador refuses, and he stiffens up and starts acting strange. And at that point I have Mikhail roll an awareness roll, and he succeeds, and I whispered to him. I stepped up and I went and whispered into that player's ear that he sees like bits of blood and bits of flesh stuck in his teeth, and also that his grip around Landy, who he had been hugging, sort of stiffens, and that player says, I hit him with my quarterstaff. And at that point, it's initiative, and fight begins. It was a It was a pretty exciting fight. I had made Calador a monster with some special abilities, and monsters in Dragonbane are different from NPCs. For example, the goblins earlier were NPC enemies. They functioned a lot like player characters. They have to roll to hit and everything like that. Monsters do it a bit differently. Monsters have this table of attacks that you can roll on or pick from, and they don't have to roll to hit. The attacks just happen, and then the players have to defend themselves in some way. And most of the time, you cannot parry these attacks, only dodge them, and then if there's an exception, that's called out. Nonetheless, you'll hear, again, more about that in the quest board video that's hopefully coming sometime soon. But it was a pretty exciting fight. Multiple player characters got downed, and they were making death rolls. At one point, Stumple the Druid, who is the only one with healing magic, was downed, and then when it came to his turn, he actually was affected by a paralyzing poison. Which meant he couldn't really do anything. But then when his turn came and he rolled his death roll, he rolled a demon, meaning he rolled a natural 20 because it's a roll on the system, and he got 2 failed death rolls. So that resulted in some immediate tension there. And then Mikhail was down, he managed to rally himself, and he could get healing a little bit. Except he tried several times and he rolled so poorly. Oh, poor guy. Nonetheless, there were I made some rules mistakes during this fight, which I should talk about. For one, I got, when you successfully parry an attack, and several of these attacks that I had prepared for this monster, which I made myself, I'll post the stats below, several of this monster's attacks could be parried, and so Archibald did so. And in Dragonbane, with an optional rule, when you successfully parry, you can move you and your enemy 1 square in any direction you choose. And I was pretty certain that that didn't apply to monsters, that monsters, capital M monsters, could not be moved in that way. That's incorrect. They absolutely can. I had gotten it mixed up with another similar rule, which is called shove, which is that when you attack someone with a lower strength than you and you succeed, you can push them a little bit. That doesn't apply to monsters, but the parry movement absolutely does. The second mistake I made relates to an ability that I gave to the monster, or specifically the bone he was clutching. In the original adventure, the bone is a bone of the first ever Ghoul, which is a cool idea, I just didn't use it. I made it the bone of Thanatolis, and players haven't actually encountered Thanatolis in really any way yet. But he is an important figure in my setting relating to undeath, and we'll get to that hopefully in the future. But anyway, I'd given the bone of Thanatolis, I've translated the ability from the 5e stat block of Calador, that when he's reduced to 0 HP, he regains some HP because of the bone, until the bone is destroyed. And I had done it so that also when that happens, a ghoul is created from one of the corpses, but I had specified in the rule that it was only the first time that happened, that the ghoul came back up. Because monsters are big challenges, as I saw. And so I made the mistake of having that happen twice, but I did actually catch myself and correct that, and removed it from the playing field before it had a chance to act. But here's actually another lesson that comes in, which is that it didn't really occur to some players to destroy the bone. I had Archibald's player disarmed Calador of the bone, and that was very smart and that was very good, but it didn't end the magical effect of the bone, which was connected sort of spiritually to Calador in his now ghoulish form. And didn't really occur to him to attack it. So at that point I realized that, and I said, as before, don't be afraid to hold that information and just say, you can attack the bone. Because it hadn't occurred to him that he could do that. And so I explained to him that he could do that. And so they did that. Eventually they defeated the monster. They defeated Calador. Another significant thing that happened during the session that I forgot to mention while I was recording the campaign diary is that as Calador was killed, he sort of froze and regained very suddenly his composure. And he said, in a different voice from the one he had before, he said, "He awakes. He's watching once more." And I described something far, far away stirring, an eye opening. And I didn't know at the time exactly what that meant. I had a reason for why exactly that was going to happen at that time, but I didn't know exactly what it meant at the time. I think I have an idea now. But nonetheless, I think there's a lesson there for GMs that you don't need to know exactly what these cool things mean. If you have a cool idea for something to narrate or for something to happen, you can just have that happen and figure out exactly what it means later. Don't over-prepare, don't feel the need to over-prepare, because you can figure these things out later. And now I think I know what it meant, and I think I have a cool idea for what it could mean, but I don't know if we're ever going to even find out during the course of this game. That might be something that happens when we revisit these characters at a late time, an entirely different year perhaps. I guess we'll see. But yeah, that's the sort of editor's note number 2. And then they headed back to Goldwyn after a few days. We fast-forwarded through that because, again, we had a limited time. And they get paid the remainder of their reward. And then they find 2 notices on that notice board I mentioned earlier in the trading post. And one of them was announcing a tournament. And another was sort of a wanted ad for adventurers to come and take a job, basically. And I present these two, as 2 options. Obviously, they could have chosen neither and done something else, but chances were they were going to pick one of the 2, and they did. They ended up picking the tournament, which was in the Yislik Empire, which is another kingdom, another state rather, and it's pretty far away. So that we're going to start off next session with them traveling. I'll put the because I made handouts for the those 2 notices. And I'll put the PDFs for those in the description below as well, because I think that might be fun for some people. But yes, that's pretty much where we left off. And we're going to come back in 3 weeks' time, which is a while, simply because, we're all students and we work during the summer and our schedules are incongruous with one another and a bit inconsistent. So unfortunately it's going to be a little while, but hopefully by then I will actually have my physical copy of the game, and I will be able to actually use the treasure cards and everything like that for the next adventure I prepare. So I hope for the 2 people watching this, they enjoyed it, and I hope they got some value out of it. For my players, perhaps they enjoy getting a peek behind the curtain, or the GM screen rather, and perhaps maybe they realize that it's not that difficult to be a GM, and maybe they'll do it for me sometime. It's my hope. But yes, I think that's it. So thank you for watching, and catch you next time.